In March 2015, cameras descended into the pitch-black depths of the Philippine Sea and captured something that shouldn't exist. The IJN Musashi, the world's largest WWII battleship, sitting broken on the ocean floor after 71 years. But here's what nobody expected. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a reunion. Because when the footage surfaced, a 94-year-old man broke down crying. He recognized something on that wreck that changed everything we thought we knew about that day in 1944. And what he revealed next will make you question everything you've heard about the Pacific War. You see, for 7 decades, this ship was more than just missing. It was a ghost, a 73,000-ton monster that vanished into the depths with over 1,000 souls aboard. The families never got closure. The survivors never got peace. And the world never got answers. But that changed when Microsoft billionaire Paul Allen decided to do something that everyone said was impossible. He was going to find the unfindable. And when he did, he uncovered secrets that had been sleeping in the deep for 3/4 of a century. What those cameras revealed wasn't just twisted metal and coral-covered guns. It was evidence of humanity's final moments, personal belongings scattered across the sea floor, messages that were never delivered, and most haunting of all, the exact spot where over 1,000 young men took their last breath. But there's something about this discovery that the history books won't tell you. Something that connects directly to why that 94-year-old survivor broke down when he saw the footage. And once you understand what really happened on October 24th, 1944, you'll never look at the ocean the same way again. Microsoft billionaire Paul Allen spent 8 years and millions of dollars searching for a ship that experts said would never be found intact. Think about that for a second. This is a guy who co-founded Microsoft, who had access to technology that would make NASA jealous, and even he couldn't guarantee he'd find this thing. The experts had good reason to be skeptical. When the Musashi went down in 1944, she didn't just sink like you see in the movies. She exploded, underwater. The massive battleship literally tore herself apart as she descended through the crushing depths of the Philippine Sea. Most naval historians believe there wouldn't be anything left to find except scattered debris spread across miles of ocean floor. But Allen wasn't just looking for any old shipwreck. The Musashi wasn't just big. She was a 73,000-ton monster with 18-inch armor plating that could supposedly withstand anything the Americans threw at her. Her main guns could fire shells the size of small cars over 25 miles with pinpoint accuracy. She was designed to be unsinkable, unstoppable, unbeatable. To put this in perspective, imagine trying to sink the Empire State Building. That's essentially what the Americans had to do in 1944. This wasn't just a ship. It was a floating fortress that represented the absolute pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering. Every rivet, every plate of steel, every inch of her construction was a testament to a nation's determination to rule the Pacific. The search itself was like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of Texas. The Philippine Sea covers over 2 million square miles of some of the deepest water on Earth. Allen's team had to use historical records, survivor testimonies, and cutting-edge sonar technology just to narrow down the search area to a manageable size. For 8 years, Allen's research vessel Octopus crisscrossed the Philippine Sea. They deployed autonomous underwater vehicles, deep-sea cameras, and sonar arrays that could map the ocean floor in incredible detail. Every blip on the sonar could be the Musashi. Every unusual formation on the seafloor could be the break they were looking for. And then, on March 2, 2015, everything changed. The ROV's camera lights pierced through the eternal darkness at 1,350 meters below the surface. At first, it looked like just another rocky outcrop on the sea floor. But as the camera moved closer, details began to emerge that made the entire search team hold their breath. Here's where it gets weird. Allen's team found her in 3 massive pieces, and the bow section was sitting upright like she was still trying to sail. Picture this: the front third of the world's largest battleship, standing proud on the ocean floor like some kind of underwater monument. Her massive anchor chain still hung from the hawse holes. The forward gun turrets, each weighing more than a modern destroyer, sat silent and waiting. The stern was completely flipped upside down, revealing the massive propellers that once drove this beast through the waves at 27 knots. Between the bow and stern sections, the middle of the ship had been completely obliterated. Twisted metal, scattered debris, and personal effects created a trail of destruction that stretched for hundreds of meters across the sea floor. But it was what they found scattered between the major sections that really got everyone's attention. Personal belongings, ammunition, pieces of the ship's superstructure, and something that would soon make a 94-year-old survivor's blood run cold. The discovery made international headlines. Naval historians called it the find of the century. Museums around the world wanted access to the footage. But for one elderly man living quietly in Japan, this wasn't just archaeological news. It was a summons from ghosts he'd been trying to forget for 71 years. And that's when the real story began. Because to understand why this discovery shattered an old man's world, you need to know what really happened on October 24th, 1944. You need to understand that this wasn't just a battle. It was 5 hours of absolute hell that turned the world's mightiest battleship into a floating coffin for over 1,000 young men. The official story says the Musashi sank after taking 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, but survivor accounts reveal something far more terrifying. The numbers don't tell you about the screaming. They don't tell you about the blood running down the deck like rainwater. And they sure as hell don't tell you about what it sounds like when a 73,000-ton battleship starts dying. October 24th, 1944 started like any other day for the 2339 men aboard the Musashi. They were part of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, steaming toward Leyte Gulf to disrupt the American invasion of the Philippines. It was supposed to be their moment of glory. The moment when Japan's super battleships would finally prove their worth and turn the tide of the Pacific War. Koji Hayakawa was just 15 years old, barely old enough to shave, serving as an aerographer, basically a weather specialist. Like most of the crew, he was just a kid who'd been swept up in his nation's war machine. He had dreams beyond the war. Maybe he'd go home and become a teacher. Maybe he'd marry the girl from his village who wrote him letters. Maybe he'd live to see 16. At 10:27 a.m., those dreams started dying along with everything else aboard the Musashi. The first wave of American aircraft came in low and fast. Koji was in a deck-facing room when the world exploded around him. The bomb hit so close he could feel the heat wash over him like opening an oven door. The concussion threw him against the bulkhead hard enough to crack ribs. When the smoke cleared, 2 of his friends were dead. One had been struck in the head. Koji never described what that looked like, but he never forgot it either. The other took shrapnel in the abdomen. He lived long enough to know he was dying. Long enough to call for his mother. Koji held his hand as the light faded from his eyes. But this was just the beginning. Shrapnel from that first explosion lodged in Koji's right arm. A hard, bone-like lump that he carries to this day, 80 years later. Every morning when he wakes up, every time he reaches for something, every time someone asks about that scar, he's transported back to October 24th, 1944. Back to the day the Giants fell. For 5 straight hours, wave after wave of American aircraft pounded the ship. This wasn't just an attack, it was systematic destruction. The Americans had learned from previous battles that Japanese super battleships were nearly impossible to sink with conventional attacks, so they brought everything they had. Torpedo bombers came in at wave-top level, their fish running hot and true toward the Musashi's massive hull. Each torpedo that struck sent shockwaves through the entire ship. Men on the far side of the vessel could feel the explosions through the deck plates. The ship would shudder, list a few degrees more, and keep fighting. Dive bombers screamed down from 10,000 feet, their bombs designed to penetrate the Musashi's thick armor plating. When they hit, the explosions weren't just loud. They were felt in your bones. They rattled your teeth. They made your ears bleed. And slowly, methodically, they were tearing the ship apart from the inside. But here's what the history books won't tell you. The crew kept fighting even as the ship was literally sinking beneath their feet. Anti-aircraft gunners stayed at their posts as water rushed into the lower decks. Engine room crews worked desperately to maintain steam pressure even as their compartments flooded. Medical personnel treated the wounded in sick bays that were slowly filling with seawater. Captain Toshihira Inaguchi moved through the ship like a man possessed. He knew his vessel was doomed, but he also knew that every minute the Musashi stayed afloat was another minute his men had to live. He ordered counter-flooding to keep the ship level. He redirected damage control teams to the most critical areas. He did everything a captain could do to save his ship and his crew. But physics is a harsh master, and the ocean is an unforgiving enemy. By mid-afternoon, the Musashi was listing 30 degrees to port. Her massive gun turrets, each weighing hundreds of tons, were starting to shift. Water was pouring into her vital spaces faster than the pumps could handle. The engine rooms were flooding. The boiler rooms were flooding. The ship was slowly drowning from the inside. And that's when something happened that haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. As the ship began her final death roll, Captain Inaguchi made a decision that epitomized the Japanese military code of honor. He was going down with his ship. No lifeboats for the captain. No rescue attempts. He would share the fate of his vessel and the men who couldn't be saved. But for the crew members who could still escape, those final moments were a nightmare that would replay in their minds for decades. They were singing their national anthem while floating in oil-covered water, watching their friends disappear one by one into the darkness. The oil was so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Men who had survived the explosions and the sinking were now drowning in crude oil, calling out for help that would never come. Koji Hayakawa found himself thrown into the sea when the ship finally capsized at 7:36 p.m. The impact fractured his left hand, but that was the least of his problems. He was surrounded by hundreds of other survivors, all of them struggling to stay afloat in water that was more oil than seawater. The lucky ones found pieces of debris to cling to. The unlucky ones simply vanished beneath the surface. In the growing darkness, voices rose from the oil-slicked water. They were singing Kimigayo, the Japanese national anthem. It started with just a few voices, but soon hundreds of men were joining in. Their voices carried across the water like a funeral dirge, a final act of defiance against the sea that was claiming them. But one by one, those voices went silent. Exhaustion, hypothermia, oil poisoning. The sea took them all with equal indifference. By the time rescue ships arrived, 1,376 men had been pulled from the water, but 1,023 souls had already joined their ship in the depths of the Philippine Sea. And for the survivors like Koji Hayakawa, the real suffering was just beginning. Because surviving when so many others died isn't a blessing. It's a burden that weighs heavier with each passing year. Which brings us to the most heartbreaking part of this story, and why that 94-year-old man broke down when he saw the footage in 2015. Of the 2,399 men aboard the Musashi, only 1,376 were rescued that night. But survival came with a price nobody talks about. You see, when most people think about war, they think about the fighting, the explosions, the dramatic moments that make it into movies. But the real war starts when the guns go silent. The real war is what happens inside the minds of the people who lived when everyone around them died. Koji Hayakawa spent decades delivering death benefits to the families of his fallen shipmates. Imagine having to knock on someone's door and hand them an envelope that represents their son's life. Imagine looking into a mother's eyes and trying to explain why her boy isn't coming home while you get to keep breathing. Every visit, he heard the same words. You were lucky. Lucky. That word became like a knife twisting in his chest. Lucky to watch his friends die. Lucky to carry their screams in his nightmares. Lucky to wake up every morning knowing that 1,023 better men than him were sleeping forever on the ocean floor. But luck felt like a curse when he remembered his friends' faces in those final moments. The boy who talked about his girlfriend back home every single day. The young seaman who carried a picture of his newborn daughter he'd never seen. The cook who promised to teach everyone his mother's recipe for miso soup when they got back to port. These weren't just statistics. They weren't just names on a casualty list. They were brothers, friends, fellow human beings who had hopes and dreams and families waiting for them. And they were all gone while Koji got to live. This is survivor's guilt on a scale most people can't imagine. These men carried the weight of 1,023 deaths for 71 years. They couldn't forget the voices singing in the dark water. They couldn't forget watching their captain choose to go down with the ship. And they sure as hell couldn't forget that they lived when so many others didn't. The Japanese government tried to help, of course. They provided pensions for the survivors. They built memorials. They held ceremonies every year on October 24th to honor the dead. But none of that could silence the voices that called out to the survivors in the dark hours before dawn. Koji Hayakawa wasn't alone in his suffering. All across Japan, Musashi survivors were struggling with the same demons. Some turned to alcohol to numb the pain. Others withdrew from society completely, unable to connect with people who couldn't understand what they'd been through. Many never talked about their experiences at all, taking their stories to the grave rather than burden their families with the truth. But perhaps the cruelest irony was that many of these survivors went on to fight in other battles. The war didn't end when the Musashi sank. These traumatized young men were reassigned to other ships, other units, other battles, where they could watch even more friends die for a cause that was already lost. Of the 1,376 men rescued from the water that night, only about 450 survived the entire war. The others died in subsequent battles, in kamikaze attacks, in the final desperate months when Japan was throwing everything it had at the advancing Allied forces. They survived the sinking of the world's largest battleship, only to die in anonymous skirmishes that history has forgotten. For those who did make it home, the challenges were just beginning. Post-war Japan was a broken country, physically and emotionally devastated by defeat. Food was scarce. Jobs were impossible to find. The entire social structure that had defined Japanese life for centuries had collapsed. And in the middle of this chaos, war veterans were trying to figure out how to live normal lives after experiencing hell. Koji Hayakawa found work in a government office, processing benefits for war widows and orphans. Every day he dealt with the families of men who hadn't come home. Every day he was reminded of his own survival while surrounded by evidence of others' sacrifice. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who lived was spending his life serving the families of those who died. The paperwork told the stories in cold, bureaucratic language. Killed in action. Missing, presumed dead. Died of wounds received in combat. But behind every file was a human story of loss and grief that Koji understood all too well. And through it all, he carried that piece of shrapnel in his arm, a physical reminder of October 24th 1944, that would never let him forget. Doctors offered to remove it over the years, but Koji always refused. It was his burden to bear, his connection to the friends who didn't make it home. The survivors also had to deal with a changing narrative about the war. In the immediate aftermath of Japan's defeat, the country went through a period of intense self-reflection and pacifism. The military values that had sent these young men to war were suddenly seen as the cause of Japan's destruction. The ships they had served on, the battles they had fought, the friends they had lost, all of it was reframed as a tragic mistake. This created another layer of psychological trauma for the survivors. Not only did they have to live with the guilt of survival, but they also had to watch as their society rejected everything they had sacrificed for. The emperor they had been willing to die for renounced his divinity. The military code that had shaped their identities was discredited. The very meaning of their suffering was called into question. For 71 years, Koji Hayakawa and the other Musashi survivors lived with these burdens. They grew old carrying secrets that were too heavy to share. They watched their numbers dwindle as time took what the war had spared. They attended fewer and fewer reunions as their brotherhood slowly dissolved into memory. And then, in March 2015, everything changed again. Which brings us back to that footage from 2015 and why it broke a 94-year-old man's heart before it finally began to heal it. When Koji Hayakawa saw the underwater footage, he didn't just see a shipwreck, he saw his brother's grave. After 71 years of wondering, of imagining, of trying to forget, he was finally face to face with the place where his friends had died and where his own innocence had been lost forever. The footage was grainy, filtered through thousands of feet of dark water, but Koji recognized every detail. The massive bow section, sitting upright on the seafloor like a monument to fallen heroes. The twisted remains of gun turrets where he had worked alongside boys who never got to become men. The scattered debris field where personal belongings lay, scattered like memories across the ocean floor. But it was one specific detail that broke him. There, clear as day on the wreck, was the Imperial Chrysanthemum seal. The same symbol he'd saluted as a teenager. The same emblem that represented everything they'd fought and died for. Still there, still intact, after 7 decades underwater. That seal represented more than just imperial authority. It was a symbol of belonging, of purpose, of the brotherhood that had bound these young men together in life and death. Seeing it again, preserved in the deep like some kind of underwater shrine, brought back every emotion Koji had been suppressing for 7 decades. The discovery of the Musashi wasn't just archaeological news for Koji and the other surviving crew members. It was proof that their friends hadn't simply vanished into nothingness. Their final resting place had been found. Their sacrifice had been witnessed. Their story could finally be told. In 2015, despite his advanced age and failing health, Koji Hayakawa made the journey to the coordinates where his ship lay broken. The trip from Japan to the Philippines was exhausting for a 94-year-old man, but nothing could have kept him away. This was his chance to fulfill a promise he'd made to himself 71 years earlier. Standing on the deck of the research vessel, looking out over the exact spot where his world had ended and begun again, Koji did something he'd been wanting to do for 7 decades. He called out to the depths, "Brothers, I'm here." The words carried across the water like a prayer, like an apology, like a promise finally kept. For 71 years, he'd been the messenger carrying their memory. Now he was the witness confirming their legacy. But Koji wasn't alone in his journey back to the Musashi. Other survivors, their children, and their grandchildren made similar pilgrimages to the site. Each one brought their own stories, their own grief, their own need for closure. One survivor brought a bottle of sake to pour into the water. sharing one last drink with his fallen comrades. Another brought letters from family members who had waited decades for their loved ones to come home. A third brought photographs. Young faces frozen in time. Forever 18 or 19 or 20 years old. The Philippine government, recognizing the historical and emotional significance of the wreck, declared the site a protected underwater archaeological zone. No artifacts could be removed. No salvage operations would be permitted. The Musashi would remain undisturbed, a permanent memorial to the 1,023 men who died with her. For the families of the lost sailors, the discovery provided something they'd never had, a place to grieve. For 71 years, they'd had no grave to visit, no physical location where they could honor their dead. Now they had coordinates, they had photographs. They had proof that their loved one's final resting place was being protected and honored. The underwater footage revealed intimate details that brought the human cost of war into sharp focus. Personal effects scattered across the seafloor, combs, buttons, pieces of uniforms, small tokens that had once meant everything to young men far from home. These weren't just historical artifacts. They were the final possessions of sons, brothers, fathers, and friends. Marine growth had covered much of the wreck, creating an underwater garden where tropical fish swam through what had once been the most powerful warship in the world. Nature had reclaimed the Musashi, transforming a weapon of war into a reef teeming with life. There was something poetic about that transformation, death giving way to life, destruction becoming a foundation for creation. The discovery also revealed the incredible violence of the ship's final moments. The way the hull had been torn apart, the massive pieces scattered across hundreds of meters of seafloor, spoke to the tremendous forces involved in the sinking. This wasn't just a ship that had slipped beneath the waves. This was a vessel that had been literally torn apart by the fury of war. But for Koji Hayakawa, standing on that research vessel in 2015, none of the technical details mattered. What mattered was that he'd kept his promise. He'd carried their memory for 71 years, and now he'd brought it back to where it belonged. It wasn't just closure. It was an apology he'd been carrying for 71 years. An apology for surviving when they didn't. An apology for living a full life while they remained forever young. An apology for sometimes forgetting their faces or struggling to remember their names. But maybe most importantly, it was a reunion. For the first time since October 24, 1944, Koji Hayakawa was with his brothers again. Not in the way he'd hoped as a young man, but in the only way that time and circumstance would allow. The emotional weight of that moment, standing over the grave of 1,023 young men while being one of the last living witnesses to their sacrifice, was almost unbearable. But it was also liberating. For 71 years, Koji had carried their story alone. Now the whole world could see where they rested and understand the price they'd paid. And that's when Koji realized something that would change how he spent his remaining years. This story reveals something much bigger about how the ocean keeps our darkest secrets and why some discoveries matter far beyond their historical significance. The Musashi wreck isn't just a historical artifact. It's a time capsule that preserves the exact moment when imperial ambition crashed into reality. And what it teaches us about memory, loss, and the stories we choose to remember goes far beyond naval history. At 1,350 meters down, everything stops. The crushing pressure and near-freezing temperatures create a kind of underwater museum where time stands still. There's no rust like you'd see on land, no decay from weather or insects. The ship sits exactly as it was in its final moments, with personal effects scattered around like the crew just stepped away for a moment. Think about that. For 71 years, while the world above changed beyond recognition, the Musashi remained frozen in time. The same buttons that sailors had sewn onto their uniforms still lay where they'd fallen, The same ammunition that had been ready to fire still sat in storage compartments. The same ship's bell that had called men to duty still hung silent in the depths. The ocean doesn't judge. It doesn't care about politics or nationalism, or who was right or wrong. It just preserves. And sometimes, like with the Musashi, it gives us back our ghosts when we're finally ready to face them. But here's what's really remarkable about this discovery. It came at exactly the right time. If Paul Allen had found the Musashi in 1975, the emotions would have been too raw. The survivors would have been too traumatized to process what they were seeing. If he'd found it in 2025, most of the survivors would already be gone, taking their stories with them. Instead, the discovery happened in that perfect window when the last witnesses were still alive but had gained enough distance from their trauma to confront it constructively. Koji Hayakawa was 94, old enough to have processed his experiences, wise enough to understand their significance, but still healthy enough to make the journey back to his brothers. The timing wasn't just coincidental, it was necessary, because this story needed to be told by someone who was there. Someone who could look at that underwater footage and recognize not just a historical curiosity, but a sacred site where his friends had died. The discovery also revealed something profound about how we remember war and loss. For decades, the Musashi had existed primarily in statistics and strategic analyses. She was discussed in terms of tonnage and armament, battle formations and tactical decisions. The human element, the 2,399 individual stories of the men who served aboard her, had been largely forgotten. But seeing the wreck brought those human stories flooding back. Suddenly, this wasn't just a military asset that had been sunk in combat. It was a gravesite where young men had spent their final moments singing their national anthem while floating in oil-covered water. It was a place where friendships had been forged and shattered, where boys had tried to become men before the war took that chance away from them. The preservation of personal effects on the wreck site adds another layer of poignancy to the story. These small, intimate objects, combs, buttons, pieces of clothing, serve as reminders that war isn't just about grand strategies and historical forces. It's about individual human beings, with hopes and fears and relationships and dreams. In a larger sense, the Musashi represents something universal about loss and memory. Every family has stories like this, not necessarily from war, but from moments when life changed irrevocably. The grandparent who died too young, the brother who never came home from his adventure, the friend who was taken by accident or illness before their time. We all carry pieces of shrapnel from these experiences. Maybe not literal metal embedded in our arms like Koji Hayakawa, but emotional fragments that remind us daily of what we've lost and who we've failed to save. The Musashi's story resonates because it's really our story, the story of how we cope with survival when others don't, how we honor the dead while continuing to live, how we find meaning in losses that seem senseless. The fact that the ocean preserved this story for 71 years before revealing it also speaks to something profound about timing and readiness. Sometimes we're not prepared to confront our ghosts when they first appear. Sometimes we need decades to develop the emotional maturity to handle the full weight of our experiences. Koji Hayakawa couldn't have made peace with his survival in 1944 or 1954 or even 1994. He needed those 71 years to understand that his guilt was misplaced, that his survival wasn't a betrayal of his friends, but a responsibility to their memory. He needed to become an old man before he could forgive the young man he'd been. The Musashi's discovery also raises questions about what other stories are waiting in the deep, what other ghosts are preserved in the ocean's memory. Thousands of ships have been lost in conflicts around the world. Each one carries its own cargo of human stories, its own collection of interrupted lives and unfinished dreams. But perhaps the most powerful lesson from the Musashi story is about the importance of bearing witness. For 71 years, Koji Hayakawa and the other survivors were the only living links to what happened on October 24, 1944. They were the keepers of their dead friends' stories, the guardians of memories that would otherwise be lost forever. Their willingness to share those memories, even when it was painful, even when it reopened old wounds, ensured that the 1,023 men who died with the Musashi wouldn't be forgotten. They transformed their survival guilt into a sacred responsibility to honor the dead by keeping their stories alive. And now, with the physical wreck site identified and protected, those stories have a permanent home. Future generations will be able to visit the coordinates where the Musashi rests and understand that this isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a place where real people face their final moments with courage and dignity, where young men sang their national anthem as they slipped beneath the waves. Which leaves us with the question that's been haunting naval historians for decades, and the reason why discoveries like this matter far beyond their historical significance. The ocean keeps our secrets until we're ready to face them. It preserves our stories until we're mature enough to understand them. And sometimes when the timing is just right, it gives us the chance to heal wounds we didn't even know we were still carrying. For Koji Hayakawa, the discovery of the Musashi wasn't just the end of a 71-year search for answers. It was the beginning of a new understanding about survival, memory, and the responsibility we all carry to honor those who came before us. The deep remembers everything. The question is, are we ready to remember with it? What other giants are sleeping in the deep? Subscribe for more untold stories from the ocean's graveyard.